Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at birthright citizenship in the U.S., and specifically how President-elect Trump might be able to take it to the Supreme Court. Our source material today is an article from the Epoch Times. It's from November 25th, so just a couple of days ago. And the title is, Trump Could Prompt Supreme Court Ruling on Birthright Citizenship.
I think what's so interesting about this is that birthright citizenship, it's rooted in the 14th Amendment. It feels like such a foundational thing. And yet here we are
Yeah.
with it possibly, being completely upended.
Yeah, it definitely feels like we're at a crossroads here. So just make sure everyone listening is on the same page. Birthright citizenship means that if you're born within U.S. borders, you automatically become a U.S. citizen. And that comes from the 14th Amendment. But Trump's big campaign promise was to end birthright citizenship. And the article really digs into whether he could actually do that and whether or not that would lead to like a Supreme Court showdown.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, the potential consequences of a Supreme Court case like this are pretty huge.
So let's break down Trump's plan a little. The article says that he wants to end birthright citizenship by executive order.
Which is pretty bold.
It is. So what would that look like exactly? Like what actions could he actually take?
Well, the article suggests that he could basically direct agencies like the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security to reinterpret the 14th Amendment, which is kind of what Laura Rees, who's a director of the Border Security and Immigration Center at the Heritage Foundation, have been suggesting.
Oh, okay. So instead of like trying to pass a new law or like a constitutional amendment, he could just change how the existing amendment is applied.
Yeah, it would definitely be a faster way to do it.
Yeah.
But, and this is a big but, it would almost certainly lead to a bunch of legal challenges from groups who say that he's overstepping his authority. And that's how we can end up with that Supreme Court battle.
Okay, so that brings us to the 14th Amendment itself, which says that anyone born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof is automatically a citizen. So like on the surface, that seems pretty clear, right?
Yeah, you would think so.
Yeah.
But the big debate here is around that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Because what it really comes down to is, does that include the children of undocumented immigrants?
Okay, so that's where the gray area is. The article talks about a Supreme Court case from 1898, United States v. Wong Kim Ark. And in that case, the court ruled that a child born in the U.S. to legal Chinese residents was automatically a citizen. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the same applies to children of parents who are here illegally, right?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Wong Kim Ark didn't specifically address that situation, so it's really open to interpretation.
And I'm guessing that's exactly what could end up in front of the Supreme Court. So let's say it does get there. What are some of the ways this could play out?
One possibility is that the court could just decide to uphold a lower court's ruling. That supports Trump's policy. And that would effectively end birthright citizenship as we know it. But if they actually take up the case, then things get a lot more complicated.
Yeah, because then they'd have to look at Wong Kim Ark and figure out how it applies today. The article also mentioned that Justices Alito and Thomas might be retiring soon, and if Trump gets to appoint their replacements, that could have a huge impact on this case.
Oh, yeah, for sure. If he appoints judges who agree with him, then that would definitely swing things in his favor.
Now, for the part that I've found super interesting, the article talks about Judge James Ho, who's arguing that birthright citizenship might not even apply if the country is experiencing an invasion.
Oh, wow.
I know, right?
That's pretty intense.
It is. So he's basically saying that the normal rules of citizenship don't apply when a country is under attack.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's connecting what's happening in the border to national security and even comparing it to the unlawful combatant debate after 9/11.
So does he think that's actually legal? Like, does he have any basis for that argument?
He says he does. He's pointing to Article 4 of the Constitution, which says that states have the right to defend themselves against invasions. And he's arguing that this right also applies to the federal government.
Okay, so that's interesting. It's worth pointing out here that Trump himself has used that word invasion to describe what's happening at the border.
He has. And he's even hinted at using the military to deal with it.
Exactly. And the article mentions an NPR poll that found that a majority of Americans actually agree that the situation at the border is an invasion.
Wow.
I know, right? So this isn't just some like theoretical legal argument. It's actually tapping into something that a lot of people are feeling. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the financial side of this.
What?
The article quotes the Federation for American Immigration Reform,
Okay.
and they estimate that undocumented immigrants and their U.S.-born children cost taxpayers something like $182 billion every year.
That's a lot of money.
It is, but I have a feeling that this goes way beyond money.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
This is about so much more than just dollars and cents.
Mm-hmm.
The article highlights the bigger societal debate that's happening, with groups like the ACLU coming out really strongly against any attempt to deny birthright citizenship based on a parent's immigration status.
Right.
They're calling it legally wrong, morally repugnant, and dangerous.
So we've got concerns about national security and economic burdens on one side, and then arguments about human rights and equal protection under the law on the other.
Exactly. It's complicated stuff.
It really is. But what I'm finding really interesting is this whole debate around how to interpret that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Can we dig into that a little more?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a phrase that legal scholars have been arguing about for decades.
Mm-hmm.
To really understand it, we need to go back in time a little bit. So the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, just after the Civil War,
Okay.
and its main purpose was to guarantee citizenship rights to formerly enslaved African Americans.
So it was created in response to a very specific historical context.
Exactly. At the time, there was a lot of concern that Southern states might try to deny citizenship to freed slaves.
Yeah.
So the amendment made it very clear that anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen, regardless of race or a previous condition of servitude.
That makes sense. But how did this amendment that was meant to address slavery become relevant to the debate about birthright citizenship for the children of immigrants today?
Well, it all comes down to that phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Over the years, courts have interpreted that phrase in different ways.
Okay, so subject to the jurisdiction thereof has become like a legal battleground. Can you explain what those different interpretations are?
Sure. One interpretation is that jurisdiction just means being born on U.S. soil. So under this view, anyone born within the physical borders of the U.S. is automatically a citizen.
Okay, that seems pretty straightforward, but I'm guessing there's another side to this.
There is. Some legal scholars argue that jurisdiction means more than just physical presence. They say it means being fully subject to U.S. law and owing allegiance to the U.S. government.
So under this interpretation, children of undocumented immigrants wouldn't necessarily qualify for birthright citizenship because their parents aren't fully subject to U.S. law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They argue that historically there have been exceptions to birthright citizenship, like for children born to foreign diplomats
Yeah.
who have diplomatic immunity.
So the idea is that undocumented immigrants are kind of outside the full jurisdiction of U.S. law, and therefore their children wouldn't automatically be citizens.
Right. And this is the interpretation that some conservative legal scholars
Yeah.
and politicians like President-elect Trump are supporting.
Man, this is complicated. It's like every word matters.
It does. The way the Supreme Court decides to define subject to the jurisdiction thereof will have a huge impact on the future of birthright citizenship in this country.
Which brings us back to those potential Supreme Court scenarios we were talking about. One possibility is that the court could uphold a lower court's ruling in favor of Trump's executive order, which would basically end birthright citizenship as we know it. But if the court actually decides to hear the case, things could get even more complicated.
Yeah, they could rule against Trump
Yeah.
and reaffirm the current interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Or they could go in a totally different direction and reinterpret Wong Kim Ark.
And what would reinterpreting Wong Kim Ark look like?
Well, they could narrow its scope and say that it only applies to children born to legal residents, not to children born to undocumented immigrants. Or they could issue a broader ruling that clarifies the meaning of subject to the jurisdiction thereof in a way that has much wider implications.
So it really feels like a lot is riding on how the court interprets those few words.
It does. Words have power. The way we interpret them can literally shape the course of history.
Absolutely. But before we get too deep into the legal weeds here, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. The potential for a humanitarian crisis if birthright citizenship were to be revoked. The article says that the Pew Research Center estimated back in 2016 that there were around 4 million children in the U.S. with undocumented immigrant parents.
That's right. And if birthright citizenship were suddenly revoked, it's not clear what would happen to those 4 million people. Would they be deported along with their parents? Would they become stateless? It's a really tough question.
It's hard to even imagine the kind of chaos and uncertainty that would create.
It would be devastating for those families.
And it's not just about those 4 million children either. It's about the precedent it would set.
Exactly. It's about who gets to be American in the future.
The article did mention that. Chris Hajek, who's the director of litigation at the Immigration Reform Law Institute, doubts that the Supreme Court would retroactively revoke birthright citizenship for people who already have it.
Yeah, that would be incredibly complicated, both
Yeah.
legally and logistically.
But even if it only applied to people born after the ruling, the impact would still be massive.
Oh, absolutely. It would create a two-tiered system of citizenship, where people born before the ruling have different rights than those born after. It would be a mess.
Wow. It seems like we're just scratching the surface of how complicated this is.
We are.
What are some other things we should be thinking about?
Well, one thing to consider is the impact on state and local governance. If birthright citizenship were revoked, states would likely face a lot more pressure to provide services to a growing population of non-citizens.
Right, so that raises questions about funding for things like education and healthcare, and even law enforcement.
Exactly. States would have to figure out how to integrate a large group of people who aren't eligible for federal benefits.
Which could lead to huge disparities between states, depending on how welcoming they are to non-citizens.
Right.
So this potential decision could have ripple effects that go way beyond the legal system.
It could reshape American society as we know it.
Now, we've been talking a lot about the legal and societal implications, but we can't forget about the political side of this. This has become a really divisive issue.
Oh, yeah, it's a huge political football. It's become a symbol of how divided we are as a country on issues like immigration and national identity.
And with this potential Supreme Court battle looming, it's only going to get more heated. And then you've got this whole invasion argument gaining traction.
Right.
The rhetoric surrounding this is really starting to heat up. But can we really call what's happening at the border an invasion in the legal sense of the word?
That's a question that legal experts are really grappling with right now. Some argue that historically the word invasion refers to a hostile military force, which isn't really what we're seeing at the border.
So using that word invasion could be a way to inflame public opinion and justify more extreme measures.
Possibly.
But then again, the article did mention that poll showing that most Americans actually agree with that characterization.
Yeah, that's true.
It's fascinating to see how legal arguments and political rhetoric are all mixed up in this.
It is. It's important to be aware of the potential biases in the information you're consuming.
Absolutely. We need to be critical thinkers and look beyond the sound bites and slogans. So we've talked a lot about the legal and societal implications, and even touched on the political side of things. But I think it's important to also consider the arguments of those who are strongly opposed to ending birthright citizenship. What are their main concerns? And how do they see this impacting American society?
Yeah, that's a great point. To really understand the full scope of this debate, we need to look at the perspective of groups like the ACLU, who see this as a fundamental human rights issue.
So you mentioned the ACLU a couple of times. What are some of the things they're saying about why they're so opposed to ending birthright citizenship?
Well, they see it as like a direct attack on the principles of equality and due process. They say that denying citizenship to someone just because of their parents' immigration status creates a really dangerous precedent.
What kind of precedent?
Well, they're worried about discrimination and the erosion of basic rights. Like, if we start making exceptions to birthright citizenship based on who your parents are, where does it stop?
So it's like a slippery slope argument. They're saying that this could lead to denying citizenship based on other factors down the line.
Exactly. The ACLU is also concerned about how this would actually work in practice. Like, imagine trying to figure out the citizenship status of millions of people based on their parents' immigration history. It would be a total logistical nightmare, not to mention incredibly expensive.
Yeah, that's a good point. It seems like trying to enforce this policy would create a whole new set of problems. The article mentioned that the ACLU called this whole thing legally wrong, morally repugnant, and dangerous.
Yeah.
Those are some strong words.
They are. And it shows how strongly they feel about this. They believe that every child born in the U.S. deserves to be a citizen, regardless of their parent's situation.
It sounds like this debate really comes down to two very different ideas about what America is.
I think you're right. On one side, you have people who see America as a nation that's built on inclusion, where birthright citizenship is a core part of our democracy. And on the other side, you have people who see America as a nation under threat, and they think we need stricter immigration controls, including limiting birthright citizenship, to protect our security and our culture.
It's like a clash between two fundamental values.
It is.
Inclusivity versus security. And this debate is happening everywhere.
It is.
In the courts, in Congress, and in people's homes.
It's a debate with no easy answers. Both sides have valid points.
They do. Well, this deep dive has been a wild ride.
It has.
We've covered so much ground, from legal precedents to potential Supreme Court battles, to this whole invasion argument and the financial and societal implications of it all.
It's a complicated issue, but hopefully we've given our listeners a better understanding of what's at stake.
I hope so. So as we wrap up here, what are some key takeaways that you would want our listeners to keep in mind as the story continues to develop?
Well, first of all, always be aware of the potential biases in the information you're getting. Whether it's a news article or a social media post, or even an expert opinion, think about where that information is coming from and what their agenda might be.
Yeah, it's so easy to get swept up in the emotions of this.
It is.
We need to be critical thinkers and not just take everything at face value.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Second, I would encourage everyone to learn more about the legal arguments on both sides. Don't just rely on sound bites or summaries. Read the actual 14th Amendment. Look at legal analyses from different perspectives and try to understand the nuances of the debate.
The more informed we are, the better we can participate in this conversation.
I agree. And finally, don't forget about the human impact of all of this. There are real people whose lives will be affected by whatever decisions are made.
Yeah, it's easy to lose sight of that when we're talking about abstract legal concepts, but these are real people with real families whose lives are on the line. Well, this deep dive has been a fascinating look at the complex world of birthright citizenship. As this issue continues to unfold, I hope our listeners will stay engaged and stay informed.
Me too.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about who gets to be an American, it's about what kind of America we want to be. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.